What's up, St. Philip family? I hope we've been journeying well, and we now move into week 3, the call of Moses. So we've been through salvation history from Adam and Eve, from that first sin. God promises us. He promises to send us a redeemer. He promises to be with us, and he promises to guide us into freedom, but he tells us it's going to be difficult. And so in the very beginning of our journey, we went through salvation history, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who is Israel and his sons through Joseph go into Egypt. And then they become this great nation in Egypt. They become very strong and very populous. And then there's a Pharaoh in Egypt who knew Joseph not, who knew the Israelites not, and just saw them as a threat. And so he enslaved them. And they become slaves, and they become oppressed, and they have to toil and work. And so the last week we just talked about that analogy of sin, that Satan is like the Pharaoh, Satan who tempts us. He tempts us and he wants to trick us and he wants to enslave us. And when we give into sin, we live the life of a slave. And it's no fun. It feels terrible. Our sin makes us miserable. For a little while, we think it's a good idea, or for a little while, we might think, okay, it's going to help me here, but it feels awful. And so we move forward. The overarching theme of this whole journey, though, is that even though these things happen, even though we fall into temptation, even though we can fall into sin, even though we can live the life of a slave, the love of God endures forever. His promise for our salvation, it never stops. And actually, what God does is even before we know it, even all around us, before we can see it, he is working for our good. He is working to set us free. And this is the story of Israel. So while Israel is enslaved and crying out to God for freedom, to liberate us, God, please deliver us from this oppressive labor. Please deliver us from these taskmasters. They're crying out to God, and God hears the cry. And so we talk about Moses this week. So the Israelites, unless they knew Moses' family or whatever, they didn't know what God was doing. They didn't know what was happening. But here's the story of Moses. So the Egyptians were very afraid of the Israelites, and they wanted them to be small in number, because when you have more people and greater numbers, you can conquer, right? So if I have more people than the other team, I have more people that can participate, and so it can be overwhelming or intimidating. So what they wanted to do is they wanted the Israelites to stop having children. They didn't want them to grow anymore because they didn't want them to continue to become greater of a nation and then maybe take them over. So they said, no more children. Well, they were still having children, but they had to be secret about it. And so Moses was born. And Moses, his mother and his family, they did it's this really beautiful story where in order to hide Moses, she made this special basket for him that was waterproof, and she put him in the river, the Nile River, and she had him float down the river, hoping that he would be found by someone who could take care of him. Someone maybe who was an Egyptian, who would take care, who would have compassion, who would have pity, so that Moses can grow up. And she had her sister, Moses' sister, she had her daughter, watch the basket as it went down. And guess what happened? Moses, the baby Moses in his little basket is floating down the river. And you know who finds him? The daughter of Pharaoh, the daughter of the king. She finds the baby and she says, oh, this must be one of the Israelites' children. She knew that, but she said, I'm going to take him as my own. She adopts Moses. She takes Moses as her own son. And so Moses then becomes a part of the royal family. He becomes a member of Pharaoh's household, and he grows up as an Egyptian. But he never forgets, and maybe his mother told him, his adoptive mother, his Egyptian mother, told him that he is a member of the Israelites, but he had the status of royalty. He was a prince of Egypt. He had the royal family. He had all the power and all the wealth and all the glory, and he was free. But he saw how the Israelites were oppressed. And here's the way God works. That no one would have ever thought that this member of Pharaoh's household, that Moses, this person who was an Israelite, but now in Pharaoh, that God was going to use him to set his people free. But he was working for their salvation. So one day Moses, he sees these Israelites being poorly treated, and something happens, and he leashes out at one of the Egyptian taskmasters, and he pushes him over and does a really terrible thing, and the taskmaster dies. And so Moses is terrified. He's like, what did I just do? But he was trying to help the Israelites, and he was so upset with the way they were being treated. But then now he's terrified, and now Pharaoh's angry at him and is seeking his life. And so Moses runs away. He runs away, and he goes into exile. And so Moses, he's cut off from his Egyptian family, he's cut off from the Israelites, and he's just living this life of exile in the desert. And then one day Moses, as he's tending these flocks, he sees something that he's never seen before. He sees a bush that's on fire, a burning bush. And what draws his attention is not just that there's a bush that's burning. He's seen fire before. He's seen wood on fire. But he said the bush is not being consumed. Meaning it's like if you saw a tree or even let's say a bush with green leaves and everything's, the way it is. You see the bushes outside, but then you see fire all around it. And we know that when things are on fire, they burn, right? They turn black and they turn into coal, charcoal, and that's just the process of burning. But what Moses saw was, man, this bush is still alive. This bush is still green. None of the bush is getting burned, and yet there's fire all around it. So he was like, whoa, I have to see this. So he comes to see this bush, and then all of a sudden, he hears his name, Moses, Moses. And from the bush, God calls Moses. That God, who has loved everyone, loved the world, and loves his people, the Israelites, who has heard their cry, who continues to work for their salvation, he is now calling Moses in this moment to be his prophet, to be the person who will call his people Israel out of slavery and out of Egypt. And so he calls Moses, and Moses says, whoa, why me? You're picking me, and how are they going to believe me? And who are you? Who am I supposed to tell them that they sent me? And he gives him his name. He says, I am who am. And when God gives his name from the burning bush, he says, I am. What he's saying to Moses and what he's saying to us is that God is not just a being. God is not another creature. God is the creator. God is all that is. I am who am. I am existence. I am the one who is the source of life and love. I am everything. And so God introduces himself that way. And he sends Moses back to the Israelites to ask Pharaoh to set them free. And so this week, what we focus on is the beautiful call of God. Isn't it amazing that Moses, even before he knew it, when he was in the moment that he was born and floating down the river, God was working for the good of him and for the whole Israel nation. That God, he works for our good, even when we don't see it, even when we don't realize it. He hears our cry. He hears our prayer. He knows our needs, and he's working for our good. And so with the Exodus event, we see how God, he weaves this beautiful, beautiful pattern of salvation that in my little moments of life, I can't see that. But when it all comes together, I realize, wow, Lord, you have been listening to me the whole time, and you've been working for my good. So this week, we focus on the call. That Moses is called, and because he said yes to his call, all of Israel was set free from Egypt. We'll see how that journey takes place. But Moses was the one that was chosen to go to Pharaoh and to ask Pharaoh to let my people go, God says. And because Moses said yes, because he was faithful to God, the Israelites eventually are led to freedom into the promised land. And the mystery there is the twofold mystery. One, that God is always working for our good, even when we can't see it. That God always hears our cry when we're in trouble, when we're in darkness, when we're in difficulty. He is already working for our salvation. We just need to hold on. We just need to see it. And the second mystery is this, is that God is calling you and he's calling me. He has a plan for each of us. He has something that he wants for us that is for our good, but not just for us, but for others, for the whole world. That when I say yes to God's call in my life, the little calls and the big calls, it's not a yes that's just for me. It's always a yes that's part of a much bigger plan that we will never possibly realize, even in this lifetime. So Moses, when he said yes to God, he had no idea how that was going to impact the whole nation. And for you and me, for us who are, for those of us who are still walking this life, when God calls us, our yes is not just for us, but it's for so many. So this week, brothers and sisters, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the love of God that is always working for our good. Maybe you can talk in your family. You can talk about the ways in which God has already done that in your family. The difficult times that you've gone through and the ways in which you've cried out to God and you've had difficult times and seen how God has actually, in a mysterious and beautiful way, sometimes miraculous way, how he's intervened and created this situation where we are able to now live in freedom, how he's brought us through difficulties, how he's brought us through those tough times in a way that we could have never planned ourselves, but he did it. And then we talk about God's call for us in our life now. Have there been times that God has called us to do something? And did we say yes? And did we see how that worked out? Or maybe there were times where we felt called and we didn't answer the call. And what does that look like? And also, am I being called right now to say yes to God in some way? So talk about those things in your family this week. Let's focus on that call this week and the way in which God never, ever, ever stops working for our good and our salvation because his love endures forever. Well, God bless you, future saints. Have an amazing week journeying as we journey, and I'll see you around.